There is a lecture outline that is going to be handed out to you very shortly. It's being copied right now. This is going to be the first of approximately 8 presentations on the subject of God and government. Tonight we're going to be asking why government. The next session will be church and state. The third will be crime and punishment. Fourth will be economics and social justice. The fifth will be the sanctity of life. Sixth, education, and probably a few other issues thrown in there as well. And then the seventh, defense and foreign policy. And the eighth, our duties to government and effective activism. So tonight, we'll be looking at Lecture 1, Why Government? Let's suppose that you're home alone, and there's a knock on the door. You go to the door, and there are 2 big, rather tough-looking men there, and they're wearing overcoats, and one's carrying kind of a violin case, but you don't think he has a violin in it. And you go to the door, may I help you? You better pay up. Pay up for what? For the protection that we give you. Well, what do you mean? Well, you see, you pay and we protect you. And if you don't pay, well, something bad might happen. You might have an accident. Your house might burn down. Or your kids might get hurt. You better pay up. Well, are you going to pay them? You might. You certainly don't want to, and you don't think you should have to, but you value your safety and your property and that of your spouse and your child and so on. So out of fear, you might go ahead and pay. But again, you think it's wrong and you resent it. Well, now let's change the picture just a little bit. Exact same scenario, except one thing. Those guys are wearing badges. And the badges say police, or sheriff, or FBI, or IRS. Does that change the picture? It does in a way, because now you've got a question of government being involved. And government, we usually think, has the right to demand certain things of us that private citizens don't have the right to demand. So what gives government the right to make those demands? Why would those guys have the right to do something just because they wear badges that they wouldn't have the right to do if they weren't wearing badges? Some of you might remember, several decades ago, there was a movie called Married to the Mob, and it focused on the wives of mafia figures. And I remember one scene that they're having a cocktail party, and all of a sudden a bunch of government agents break in and start roughing up the mafia guys. You don't feel too sorry for them, but one of the wives just tears into these government agents and says, "What gives you the right to do this? What makes you think you're any better than they are?" And they answer, "There's all the difference in the world between us. They are thieves and murderers. We work for the president." Now, when that movie came out several decades ago, that wasn't even considered funny. But what is it that makes one group of thugs legitimate just because they work for the government, and another group of thugs illegitimate because they don't? Where does government get its authority? Well, we might look at the anarchist position, which means that there is no right of government. There should be no government at all. And that's one position that a few people take, but it doesn't really work out in practice. And I don't really know of any society where they've actually tried that for any length of time without the result being complete disaster. People being what they are, we need control, and we need government for that kind of control. Another is simply that might makes right. The reason that the government has authority to do things that other people don't have the authority to do is that they're tougher than everybody else. They've taken control, and they have the muscle to stay in control, whether this is just a tribe where this guy has bigger muscles and maybe a heavier club than everybody else has, or whether it is a much more complicated society than that. But then there's another view, and that is the divine right of government. That for some reason, government has authority because God has given government authority. We find that in most pagan societies, government was thought to be God, and the rulers were thought to be gods or descendants of the gods, or at least have a little divine DNA somewhere in their genes. And being divine, they had the authority to rule. In fact, that's one way that Israel was different from other nations. In Israel, the king was appointed by God, he was selected by God, he got his authority to rule from God, but he was not God himself. That's one of the reasons that in Deuteronomy 17, when Moses predicts that the day is going to come that the people of Israel are going to demand a king for the stupidest of all possible reasons, so they can be like the nations around them. And anyway, certain restrictions are given. You can have a king and still have a legitimate government and still have a good society if you follow these rules. One of those rules was that the king was to be one of the people, that you'll not have a foreigner serving as king. Why? Because in the nations around them, they had no understanding of Jewish law, the law that restrained the power of rulers, and foreign kings were thought to be absolute, and they'd practice that absolutism when they came to the throne in Israel, just like Jezebel did and persuaded Ahab to do. But another reason is that it's pretty hard to think of the king as being divine, as being a god, if he also happens to be your second cousin. And so the idea that the king was to be one of the people and not a foreigner was the idea that in Israel, the king was not God. He gets authority from God, but he is not God himself. But then comes the view that really comes from the scriptures, and that's that the authority that monarchs have is an authority that is given to them by God. And where does that view come from? Well, there is one view that we call the divine right of kings view. This is the view that was held by the Stuart kings in England, James I in the early 1600s, Charles I and Charles II and James II. Their view was the divine right of kings, and James I was quite a scholar. He was quite a Greek scholar, too, as a matter of fact, although he didn't translate the King James Bible himself, but he did have a pretty good knowledge of Greek himself. But anyway, King James wrote a lengthy treatise based in part on his interpretations of the Bible on the divine right of kings. But the Puritans did not agree with this. The Presbyterians did not agree with this. And they agreed that authority comes from God, but it doesn't go directly to the king. And so this idea that God gives authority to monarchs, that didn't go over very well with a lot of people. And then another view is a view that we call popular sovereignty, the idea that the authority to govern is authority in the people. Vox popularis est vox Dei is the saying that was often used. The voice of the people is the voice of God. John Adams, our second president, and one of the finest scholars to ever sit in the White House, strongly disputed that view. He raised the question one time, The voice of the people is the voice of God? If the majority is 51 and the minority 49, is it certainly the voice of God? If tomorrow one should change to 50 versus 50, where is the voice of God? If 2 and the minority should become the majority, is the voice of God changed? And so Adam said that vox populi est non vox Dei, that the voice of the people is sometimes the voice of Muhammad, of Caesar, of Catiline, the Pope, and the devil. So, without totally rejecting the idea that the people have a role in their government, he could not accept this idea that the voice of the people is the voice of God. But we still have the view that comes out of this that the people many times establish their government, and they establish it by what we call social contract. That's a term that is rooted greatly in American history, although it is much earlier than that. But the idea that the people gather together and they agree among themselves to give government certain authority. And maybe this is a tribal society and everybody's sitting around a campfire and we all say, well, we can't just continue living like this without any authority. Everybody's robbing from each other and assaulting each other and so on. So we got to have somebody in charge here to enforce authority. So Olaf over there, you're a big tough guy. You're going to be the sheriff. And we're going to give you this big club. And anytime you see somebody violating the rights of somebody else, you hit them over the head with that club. Now, you're not going to have much time to grow crops or go hunting when you're serving as sheriff like this and clubbing people all the time. And so we're going to have to help you out with making a living. And so we're going to each give you 5% of all of our crops and all of our hunting, and that's how you'll make a living. That's kind of like the social contract, you might say, although we put it in a much more complicated form than that. But one view of the social contract was Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes of England, with his book Leviathan, took the view that government is by social contract from the people. However, it's not going to work unless the people give total authority to government. In other words, totally surrender your rights to government to do whatever government wants to do. Otherwise, we're going to be constantly quibbling with what kind of authority government has, and it's never going to work. So Hobbes says it has to be total authority, and that's why his book is named after a creature in the book of Job, a monster in the book of Job, the Leviathan. I can tell you that the framers of our Constitution knew about Hobbes. They quoted him occasionally, but generally when they quoted him, it was in the negative. They did not care for Hobbes's view. Now, another view that they didn't care for was that of Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France. France likewise, or rather, Rousseau likewise took the view of social contract, but he said that this is the route to freedom. But in order to be free, we have to surrender all of our rights, not to the king, he says, but to the will of the people. And then we'll be free, but we'll exercise our freedom as the people as a whole exercise their freedom. Well, our framers thought that wasn't much freedom at all. And then there was a third, John Locke. Now, John Locke, I believe, comes out of a distinctively Christian standpoint. Now, he didn't hold a completely orthodox theology in every respect. John Locke, for example, did not believe in original sin. He believed in sin, but not original sin. He believed rather in what he called the tabula rasa, or blank slate, that we're not born with a sinful nature. We're not born either good or bad. We're born with this blank slate, and it's what's written on that slate after we're born that determines what we are. We all sin, but that doesn't mean we're born sinners. Now, John Locke, as I say, I believe to be a Christian. And if you read his book on the reasonableness of Christianity, I think you'll find there that just about every doctrine of Christianity, with the exception of original sin, is a doctrine that he holds and defends. He believed in the Word of God as being inspired and inerrant. He said at one point that, and he was a man who believed strongly in the power of human reason, but he said that most of the Bible is in accord with reason. Some of the Bible is above reason, but none of the Bible is contrary to reason. Well, John Locke, coming from that Christian standpoint, has a couple of very fine works on law and government, his first and second treatises on civil government, which he bases extensively on God's Word. In his first treatise, he cites the Bible more than 80 times. But John Locke says the people get together with a social contract by which they give authority to government, but they give only limited authority to government, and government has no authority other than what we, the people, have given them through this social contract. I think it's fair to say that the framers of our system of government believed, and believed very strongly, in John Locke's view of social contract. For example, we see that in the Declaration of Independence, where they say that our independence is based upon the laws of nature and of nature's God, and that God has created all of us in a state of equality, that he has given us certain unalienable rights, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Not that government gives rights, God gives rights, but government makes possible the enjoyment of the rights that God has given. Now, I submit that that is a biblical view of government. Where do I get that? Do we see social contract in the Bible? Well, Locke says that the idea of social compact is found in the paction or pact that he says that God made with Noah, the Noachic covenant that establishes civil government. But as far as governments being instituted among men, deriving, just look at a few provisions of the scriptures here. For example, Judges 8:22. The men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule thou over us." He didn't come in and say, "I'm taking over." They gave him that authority. Or Judges 9:6. The men of Shechem made Abimelech king. Or 2 Samuel 16:18. Hushai said unto Absalom, "Nay, but whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel choose, his will I be, and with him will I abide." Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they were holding regular elections, and that on election night, the early returns came in and Absalom was ahead, because those were from the cities, but later on, the rural vote came in and they liked David because he was a shepherd and they agreed with his farm policy, and so that put David ahead. No, not necessarily, but in some way, the people consent to the institution of government. Not that they regularly re-elect their government, but they consent to the establishment of their government. Well, we've still got a question here then. Popular sovereignty versus divine right. Does governmental authority come from God, or does it come from the people? Two very different views, but can those views be reconciled? I believe they can be reconciled. And I'm going to suggest the reconciliation to these views is found in the motto of my home state of South Dakota. Motto is drafted by Pastor Joseph Ward, who is one of two statues that South Dakota has submitted to the Capitol, and he's there in the Capitol right now. But anyway, Dr. Ward, at the 1885 Constitutional Convention for South Dakota, proposed this motto that puts this together beautifully. Under God, the people rule. In other words, contrary to what James was saying, where he says that God is the source of all governmental authority. Now, the Puritans will agree to that part. he delegates some of that authority to the king. The king delegates some of that authority to lower rulers, lesser magistrates, and they rule over the people. But no, the Puritans say, and the state of South Dakota would say, that yes, God is the source of all governmental authority, but he gives that authority to the people. And the people then delegate it to the lesser magistrates, and they, in turn, establish the king, meaning that even though the king is the higher magistrate, he is responsible to the lesser magistrates, who are responsible to the people, who in turn are responsible to God. So that gives us an idea of the nature of governmental authority and what makes government legitimate. It comes from divine authority, but that authority is given to government by God through the people. Now we look at various kinds of government. Aristotle spoke of three kinds of government: monarchy, government by one; aristocracy, government by a few; or democracy, government by many. And then Thomas Aquinas, who based his thinking a lot upon Aristotle. He was a Christian, and of course, a believer in Scripture, but nevertheless, his ideas of how we get knowledge and so on would be based on Aristotle, whereas Augustine would base his more on Plato. But Aquinas took much of what Aristotle had said about kinds of government, but he divided them into good and bad. He said, there is one form of government that is government by one man. And if he's a good man, then it'll be a king. If a bad man, it'll be a tyrant. And then there is government by a few men, and if it is good government, we'll call that an aristocracy. That is government by the best, the most virtuous, the most capable people. If not, it'll be an oligarchy based upon those who are able to gain power primarily because of wealth, but maybe other means, but are going to use that solely for their own self-interest. And then there is government by a multitude. And he said if it is good, it is polity, by which he means something like a constitutional republic. And if it is bad, it is democracy. It is interesting that not only in classical thought, but in the thought of our founding fathers as well, pure democracy was not thought of favorably. They would use the term pure democracy in the sense of unfettered majority rule, in which the majority could do whatever they want, and they could run roughshod over the rights of the minority. And most of our framers would look at that and say, that's not the form of government we want. That's a dangerous form of government. And it is just as bad to be under the tyranny of the majority as it is to be under the tyranny of the minority. In fact, it's probably worse, because if majorities are being oppressed, they can pretty well take care of themselves, but if minorities are being repressed, they can't. Anyway, so those are the various forms of government. Now, a couple more things we'll look at here tonight will be, first of all, why we need government. We've seen that God has given the people the authority to establish government, but why do we need government? Well, Romans 13 gives us one answer, and the answer in Romans 13 is, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. And goes on to say that the civil ruler bears not the sword in vain, for he is an avenger, the minister of God, to execute wrath upon those that do evil. The most basic need for government, as Augustine especially recognized it, was to restrain the exercise of sin. Now, government can't take sin away. Only the Lord Jesus Christ, through his finished work on the cross, can take sin away. But government can restrain the exercise of sin. Government can cause us to decide that, yes, it might be nice to rob this jewelry store, but there's a policeman over there, and if he sees me, he'll arrest me, and they'll put me in jail, and it just isn't worth it. Crime doesn't pay. And so to restrain the exercise of sin is a basic reason for government. Another reason for government, and Peter talks about this in 1 Peter 2, where he says, let every soul be subject to the higher powers, and goes on to say, that was Romans, submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or to governors as those who are sent for our better ordering and preservation. In other words, he's saying that another reason besides restraining sin is that we need order in society, and it needs to be the kind of order that only government can supply. Regardless of the fact of sin, somebody needs to decide who has the right of way when two cars come to an intersection at the same time. Somebody needs to set up speed limits and stoplights and so on like that, and set up other regulations like this so that we can live in an orderly way. And so those are the two reasons for government. One, to restrain the exercise of sin, and second, to provide order for society. And beyond that, if government goes beyond those functions, I would suggest that government has become tyrannical and illegitimate. Now, another question: what about the need for restraint on government? James Madison made a very, very significant observation in Federalist, the Federalist number 51. He's talking about the need for checks and balances in government, restraining government power and the like. And he says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices, speaking there of checks and balances, should be necessary to control the abuses of government. And now we get into the real meat of what he's saying here. Understand he studied theology under Reverend Witherspoon at Princeton. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? Government is based upon two things. First of all, the idea that there is a high view of God and his law, and secondly, a low view of man and his nature. And most of the time, the reason theories of government don't work in practice, like socialism and communism, is they're based upon unrealistic views of the nature of man. Madison then asks, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. In other words, if we were all good, we wouldn't need government. But he seems to be implying we're not good. And then he says, if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In other words, if we're not good, but we have a group of wise, benevolent philosopher kings over there, we could just give them absolute power and they'd wield it in everybody's best interest. But Madison is saying, our rulers aren't angels either. Some of you might have begun to suspect that he's right on that point. And so he says, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. In other words, we need government that is strong enough to keep the sinful nature of man in check as much as possible, but recognizing that rulers have the same sinful nature as all the rest of us. That Calvinist doctrine of total depravity is the great leveler, means that they're just as bad as everybody else, and so we can't trust them with absolute power. So how do we set up a government that is powerful enough, but at the same time can be restrained? That's the Constitution. And I refer to it as the Founding Fathers' five-fold formula for freedom. If you like alliteration, I could probably throw in a few more phrases: famous, fantastic, fabulous, a few others. But the Founding Fathers' five-fold formula for freedom. And let's look at that formula. Part one of the formula is a government of limited delegated powers. The idea that government has only such powers as we, the people, have delegated to it, and no others. And we've delegated in our social contract, which is the Constitution. Throughout the Constitution, we delegate government certain powers, and if it's not in the Constitution, government doesn't have that power. If some governmental official says, show me where the Constitution says I can't do this, he's got it all turned around. He has to show where the Constitution says he can do it, or he doesn't have that power. The framers thought that was clear, but just to make sure nobody down here 250 years later gets it turned around, they put it in concrete in the 10th Amendment, where they said the power is not delegated to the United States, that is, to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Again, limited delegated powers, the cornerstone of what free government is all about. Second part of the formula would be separation of powers. The idea that the powers that we do delegate to government, we separate into levels and branches. We separate them vertically into federal, state, and local levels, horizontally into legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And in this way, no one branch, no one level, no one agency, no one individual has all of the power. But if that's all we did, then that wouldn't really solve the problem, because then all we'd have is a three-headed tyrant instead of a one-headed tyrant. And so that's where the next part of the formula comes in, checks and balances. Each of these branches and each of these levels of government checks the powers of the other. For example, Congress has the authority under Article 1, Section 8 to pass laws. But the president can veto those laws. But Congress can override the president's veto by a 2/3 vote of each house of Congress. The Supreme Court can strike laws of Congress and acts of the president down as unconstitutional. But there are checks on the court. For example, the justices in the court, in fact, all federal judges, are nominated by the executive branch, by the president, and confirmed by one house of the legislative branch, the Senate. They depend upon Congress for their budget. They depend upon the executive branch for their enforcement. And there are various other checks that are in the Constitution upon the powers of the courts. So checks and balances back and forth so that each branch may be just exercising their checks on the other branches, not because they're so self-certain, self-abnegating that they just want to do what's in the best interest of the nation, but they want to preserve their own power. And so in preserving their own power, they check the powers of the others. And in that way, government remains limited, and in that way, freedom is preserved. Fourth part of the formula, reserved individual rights. The framers did not establish a pure democracy in the sense of unfettered majority rule. We use that term democracy today, and some will say that's a bad word, and technically it really is. However, it's used many times today, not in the sense that the framers originally used it or that it was used in classical antiquity. We use the term democracy today for the idea of representative government, so I don't immediately stand up and start yelling and screaming every time I hear the word democracy. But the idea of pure unfettered majority rule, the framers thought was dangerous and unfair to minorities. And so that's the whole idea of establishing rights like those in the Bill of Rights. The idea that there are certain things that government cannot take away from people, even if the majority of the people want to take them away. Certain rights that we have, like freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, freedom of association, the right to own property, the right to make contracts, and so on. And one way of protecting those is what Justice Story called the palladium of our liberty, the right to keep and bear arms, the right that makes the other rights possible. Someone once described it like this, that if I had a choice between the right of free speech and the right to keep and bear arms, I would choose the right to keep and bear arms. And then I could say whatever I want because I have a gun. That's putting it a little silly, but nevertheless, the idea here is that it is a form of protection of our other rights. And finally, the last part of the formula, we've gone through limited delegated powers, separation of powers, checks and balances, reserved individual rights. Now the last, responsibility through religion. Now the framers did not want to establish a state church. And I don't think we want that either. I don't think we want the government running the church. Certainly we wouldn't if somebody like Biden was president. I don't think we really want Trump running the church either. But nevertheless, besides the role that religion plays in saving souls for eternity, and when they used the term religion, they usually used it pretty much interchangeably with Christianity. Besides the role of saving souls for eternity, religion also plays the role of producing the kind of character in people that makes responsible self-government possible. See, people need restraint. And either that's going to be self-restraint or else government is going to have to supply it. But where are people going to get the power for self-restraint? Through what religion implants in them, the good character that religion supplies. And so, as Washington said in his farewell address, of all the dispositions and habits that lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And he went on to say that it is not possible to maintain morality in the long run without religion. Our second president, John Adams, put it this way: our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. So that's the answer that our framers gave to the question, how do we give government enough power to govern effectively, but restrain that power so it does not become tyrannical and oppressive? The five-fold formula for freedom. That's their formula. And I can't think of a better one. Next week, we're going to be looking at issues of church and state. The question of the two kingdoms, or is it one kingdom with two realms? And how does that compare to the concept of separation of church and state, which is not in our Bill of Rights, but which might be, in the proper sense, a good expression of what proper government is about? Is that a good term or a bad term? We'll see that next week.